Last biogeochemical cycle Edpuzzle here. You should take a look at the POGIL on the sulfur cycle. If you didn't look at that, or you chose to not do that one, you definitely want to look at the diagram for the sulfur cycle. The sulfur cycle really revolves around volcanic eruptions and the adding of sulfur into the atmosphere through the burning of fossil fuels. So make sure you're looking through that and just making yourself familiar with the steps of the sulfur cycle. But it's similar to the phosphorus cycle, but take a look and check those steps. So the nitrogen cycle, probably one of the most important of the biogeochemical cycles, because without nitrogen, you couldn't make proteins or DNA. So it's important that you understand the processes that are going on in the nitrogen cycle and how we cycle nitrogen through the living and non-living parts of ecosystems. So remember that the cycles are looking at the movement of molecules between sources and sinks on the Earth. So the movement of nitrogen-containing molecules between the sources and the sinks, the sources are going to release nitrogen into the atmosphere, whereas the sinks are going to absorb or remove nitrogen from the atmosphere. And the reservoirs tend to hold nitrogen very short. So very short period of time compared to the carbon cycle. Remember, the carbon cycle is relatively quick, especially with photosynthesis and respiration. The nitrogen cycle is also very quick and maybe even a little bit faster because the sinks tend to release that nitrogen in a faster manner than in the carbon cycle. So the reservoirs include plants, the soil, and atmosphere. We're going to hold that nitrogen in those places. And the main reservoir is the atmosphere, because you have the most abundant gas in the atmosphere is nitrogen. It's not usable as N2, as nitrogen gas. It's not usable by plants or animals. So that's the importance of the cycle, because it fixes or brings that nutrient and makes it available for living things. Nitrogen is critical to plants and animals, like we talked about, for proteins and DNA. And the problem, like I said, is we have tons, 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. However, we can't use that nitrogen gas. So how do living things take in the nitrogen if most of it exists as unusable nitrogen gas? So the first way is through nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the process of converting nitrogen gas into biologically available molecules like ammonia and nitrate. So nitrate is NO3 and ammonia is NH3. Those are the two easiest assimilated or utilized molecules that contain nitrogen. The first thing that can happen is bacteria fixation. So bacteria are going to live in the soil, or they live in those symbiotic relationships with other plants, and they can take nitrogen gas and convert it into ammonia. So bacteria fixation fixes the atmospheric nitrogen into the soil. So fixes it and brings it and makes it more usable for plants and animals. Specific bacteria like rhizobacteria, they live in the root nodules of peas and beans. They actually take nitrogen in for the plant and then allow it to utilize that right away. I'm going to move my little face here so you can see this diagram. So that's here, okay? Synthetic fixation is when humans combust fossil fuels to convert nitrogen gas into a nitrate. That is not as common, but that can happen and create nitrates through fossil fuels. We also have nitrates in synthetic fertilizers, things like Miracle-Gro, things like fertilizers that are commercial for monocultures. Those also add nitrates to the soil. However, those can cause some more problems because it's not natural. All right, so once that nitrogen is fixed into the soil through nitrogen fixation, plants and animals take that nitrogen in through their roots or through eating, and that's called assimilation. So plant roots are going to absorb that nitrate or ammonia through their roots. Plants are going to assimilate the nitrogen by eating other plants or eating other animals. And then that is going to incorporate into their proteins and into their DNA. Once organisms take that in, they go through a process of ammonification. So that's when bacteria from the soil, microbes and decomposers take the waste from the soil, take the waste from plants and animals, and convert that back into NH3, right? To convert it back into ammonia. So ammonification is making ammonia, right, from dead and decomposing organisms. All right, so this process here. Nitrification is the conversion of NH4. So NH4 exists from some other organisms, some ammonium and ammonia complexes. NH4 is ammonium and NH3 is ammonia. Nitrification is the conversion of that ammonium into nitrate and nitrates. All right, so nitrates first and then nitrates. So nitrification is ammonia to nitrates, right? And that happens by bacteria. And then denitrification. Denitrification is taking any nitrogen that's in the soil, NO3, and turns it into a nitrogen gas, and then that converts back into the atmosphere. So nitrous oxide, N2O, and nitrous oxide can be a pollutant when it's in high amounts. That returns to the atmosphere. It'll go through a chemical reaction and then convert back to N2, nitrogen gas. So if you look here, assimilation is the taking in, ammonification is the breaking it back down and adding it to the soil, and then nitrification is converting other nitrogen-containing chemicals in the soil into usable nitrogen chemicals. And then denitrification is taking the nitrogen and putting it back into the atmosphere. Humans have an impact on the nitrogen cycle because they add chemicals to the atmosphere like nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas. That happens readily in agricultural soils that are over-fertilized and waterlogged. So that adds nitrous oxide to the atmosphere. Ammonia volatilization is when you also have excess fertilizer. It can actually lead to NH3 converting into a gaseous form and adding it to the atmosphere. That gets then picked up by precipitation and then turns into acid rain. It also means that there's less nitrogen in the soil for crops. And then leaching and eutrophication, that's when the fertilizers are carried into bodies of water, and that creates runoff and then creates algal blooms. Algal blooms are also known as eutrophication. Eutrophication is when you have too much nitrogen and too much phosphorus in the ecosystem. That's usually because of fertilizers, and they get into the local waterways through runoff. So fertilizers and animal waste run off into local waterways. The algal bloom actually covers the surface of the water, prevents photosynthesis from happening at the bottom. The algae will then die off. Decomposers are going to use up all the oxygen, and that's going to kill the aquatic organisms that live there. It creates this positive feedback loop. Less oxygen means more deaths, which means more bacterial composition, which means more oxygen is getting used. So this is just a little image that's showing you that process. All right, longer than 5 minutes, okay? But remember, you don't have to, you get to. Think of everything as a privilege. Have a great day, guys.